Before the demo starts, please prepare your 4 different cups of liquid. Small plastic cups should work. The cups should be filled with tap water, salt water, isopropyl alcohol, or IPA for short, and vegetable oil. Thank you. Now let's begin. Hi everyone. Today we will be learning about how recycling plants sort plastic that they get from our recycling bins. Before we start, I want you to collect about 10 pieces of plastic from your recycling bin and make sure you have your worksheet and a writing utensil ready. Okay, now let's begin. Have you ever thought about the plastics that we throw into our recycling bin every day? Are they all the same? What's different about them? How might they differ besides what we can see with our eyes? When we throw our plastic into the recycling bins, you may notice that they have a triangle on the bottom of them with a number 1 through 7 on them. For example, this old peanut butter jar has a triangle with the number 1 inside. This is called a recycling number. It refers to what type of plastic it is. On the bottom of your worksheet, I've provided a key to tell you which recycling is which plastic. Some plastics are not recyclable, and that's the reason you may not have seen it in your collection. For example, in the state of New York, you can only recycle recycling numbers 1, 2, and 5. And so hopefully you don't see plastics 3, 4, 6, and 7 in your recycling bin. Now I want you to sort each plastic by their recycling number. I have my collection of plastic pieces here, and I'm going to do the same. On your worksheet, you can now fill out how many pieces of plastic of each recycling number you've collected. Do you have a piece of plastic of each number? If not, what numbers are missing? So here I finished sorting my plastics. As expected, because I live in the state of New York, I only have plastics 1, 2, and 5. Of the plastics that can be recycled, they are thrown into the recycling bin and sent to the recycling plant. At the plant, they all need to be sorted by type of plastic/recycling number, like you all just did. Recycling plants sort their plastic a bit differently than you all just did, however. They don't use people to look at every piece of plastic and sort depending on the number on the bottom of each piece. That would take too long and too many people. Instead, they sort the plastics by density. This is one of the easiest ways to classify plastics. Density is the amount of mass of an object divided by the volume of that object. Each type of plastic has a specific density. By placing plastics in varying liquids with varying densities, the density of the plastic can be determined by seeing whether the plastic sinks or floats. Now that we've learned how the process generally works, we are going to replicate it right here in our homes. The first step is to grab 1 piece of plastic of each number and put the rest aside. Grab your scissors and cut a small square piece out of each. Write the plastic's recycling number on the bottom with Sharpie to help keep track when you fill out your worksheet. I'm going to do the same with my plastic. I finished picking 1 piece of plastic from each recycling number and cutting out a piece of each. Make sure these pieces are small enough that they'll fit in the cups that you've chosen for the rest of the experiment. I've also written the numbers of the recycling number on the bottom of each piece. Now it's time to bring out the 4 cups of liquids. First, we are going to use the tap water cup. So keep this cup with you and put the other 3 aside. Water has a density of 1 gram per milliliter. This means that per milliliter of water that you have, it will weigh 1 gram. Now, drop your pieces of plastic into the cup. Wait a few seconds and notice which pieces sink and which pieces float. Collect the pieces that float and put them in one pile, and collect the pieces that sink and place them in a different pile. Fill out which piece floats and sinks on the worksheet under the water test. To make sure that you figure out if your plastic sinks or floats, you first have to break the surface tension of the water. And so you'll want to press your piece of plastic down a little bit and it'll sink or it'll float back up to the top if it's supposed to. For me, my plastic number 2 floated, but my plastics number 1 and number 5 both sunk to the bottom. So I'm going to go carefully dump out this water and collect pieces 1 and 5, and then I'm going to fill out on my worksheet that number 2 floated and number 1 and 5 sunk. So far from learning about density, why do you think some of the pieces of plastic float and some sink? Are the pieces that float more or less dense than water? I'll give you a hint. Things that are more dense than something else will sink in them because they have more weight per unit volume. Things that are less dense than something else will float in them, and that's because they weigh less per unit volume. Now take the pile that floated in the tap water and grab your cup of isopropyl alcohol. Isopropyl alcohol has a density of 0.94 grams per milliliter, so it is less dense than the tap water. Drop your pieces of plastic into the cup and note which ones float and which ones sink on the worksheet. Scoop out the pieces of plastic and separate them into 2 piles, one for float and one for sink. I can see from my cup that my piece of plastic, number 2, which floated in the tap water, has now sunk in the isopropyl alcohol. Now, take the remaining pieces of plastic that floated in the IPA, dry them off, and drop them into the cup labeled vegetable oil, which has a density of 0.90 grams per milliliter. That means that it's a little bit less dense than water. Wait a few seconds and then note what sinks and what floats. Vegetable oil is the least dense liquid we are using to sort the plastics. Did any of the plastic float? If so, which ones? What can you say about this piece of plastic? I wanted to demonstrate the vegetable oil test even though my plastic number 2 had already sunk in the IPA. As a double check and/or a sanity check, I wanted to make sure that this piece of plastic would also sink in the vegetable oil, which it did. Make sure you fill out on your worksheet if your piece of plastic sunk or if it floated. Now we are going to go the other way and try liquids that are denser than water. Come back and find that first group of plastics that sunk in the tap water. My 2 remaining pieces are plastics number 1 and plastic number 5. Now drop them into the cup with salt water, which has a density of 1.2 grams per milliliter, which is heavier than water. Note which pieces of plastic float and which sink on your worksheet. For me, both of my pieces of plastic, recycling number 1 and recycling number 5, sunk in the salt water. That must mean that they're both more dense than salt water. Now, I want you to do a little thought experiment. Both of my pieces of plastic, number 1 and number 5, sunk in my salt water. That means they're both more dense than salt water. If I wanted to test which is more dense, number 1 or number 5, I could put them in a liquid that is more dense than salt water. If you have a liquid such as corn syrup in your house, you'll be able to do this experiment. If you want to, Take these pieces of plastic out of the cup, dry them off, and drop them into corn syrup and see which one sinks and which one floats. And then you'll be able to determine which one is the densest plastic. When you're finished with the saltwater test, collect all of your pieces of plastic. Can you order them from least dense to most dense? If you had a plastic that floated in vegetable oil, that is the least dense plastic. If you had a piece that sunk in the salt water, that is the densest plastic. Think back to how this relates to recycling plants sorting plastic. They put our plastic into columns, or giant cups of varying liquids, and wait for them to either sink or float. They then separate the plastics and do the same with other liquids like we did. Hopefully we now understand the process behind recycling a little bit better. Thank you for participating.